Do you ever play a game that is labeled as horror only to play it and not get scared of it? Well, that's how I feel a lot of times when I play horror games or watch scary movies, and I think the main reason why I don't get scared is that lots of horror games go for the common approach. Have these long tension building moments that lead to a scare or create the feeling that could potentially lead to something terrifying only for nothing to come from it. And then of course we have the over-reliance on jump scares, which sure, makes you scared, but not because the piece of media built up to it, but rather just made a scare that is directly connected to the reflexes in our mind. And because there are many forms of this type of media that usually take the same approach to scaring the audience, we build a sort of tolerance as to what to expect. But every so often, there's a moment that is so scary because of how unconventional it is presented. Take the claustrophobia in Iron Lung or Mr. X in Resident Evil 2 Remake. These games don't create a quick scare in the player, but rather create a buildup of fear that never quite goes away, constantly clawing at the insecurities of the player. And then there is House Benavento from Resident Evil Village. I think that this sequence is the scariest sequence in all of gaming, and especially in modern games. So that's what I'll be talking about in today's video, and why this section is so scary and why it works. And I think the best way we can start with is actually taking a brief look at the presentation of horror in Resident Evil 8, because really, removing the whole Benavento sequence makes Village one of the least scary games out there. That is not a bad thing, far from it. Although Village is the most recent mainline title in one of the longest running horror franchises, that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be scary. Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6 have all been labeled more as action horror games, having a greater emphasis on the moment-to-moment gameplay rather than the feeling of unease that the earlier titles had, which is the direction that Village takes. Although Village touches upon different elements of horror, like gothic horror in Castle Dimitrescu or some sort of futuristic horror in Heisenberg's factory, the game doesn't use these environments to scare the player, but rather use them as a showcase for the different genres that it's trying to convey. It takes the core elements from each and builds stunning backdrops for each area, making them all distinct from one another, but not just in the horror that they present, but naturally in the tone as well. However, each area could have been a lot scarier if they were built to create these moments of horror rather than just showing how it could have been. Resident Evil 7, the predecessor to Village, especially the three main encounters in that game, all had similar looking locations around the Baker house, but managed to make them all feel very different in terms of how they tried to scare the player. We had the typical slasher horror to gore, and then the unknown to psychological horror, all presented by the three members of the Baker family before we got to lackluster sections towards the endgame. Compare this to Village, where 4 out of the 5 sections all look different, but all played in a similar way. It just wasn't scary. Now, with this in mind, the baby section, or the proper way to call it, the House Benevento, is a clear outlier amongst the areas in Village, not just in terms of tone, but in gameplay as well. If you asked me otherwise, I would have thought that this section would be from an entirely different game, but no, it's just the second main dungeon-like area of the game. This game tackles the 3 types of horror in the form of cluelessness, psychological horror, and urgency in each section. And one thing that is important to note, the entire section completely removes all your weapons, further making this section of the game stand out that much more, as it fundamentally plays differently from how the base game is designed. Starting in the first area, you are thrown into what I think is the best way to call this an escape room. Although I have never been in an escape room, this room is exactly what I imagine an escape room feeling like. You have your clues everywhere around you, and you have to find out how you can piece them together to find your escape. It really sparks this feeling of cluelessness for how sudden this section appears and the problems it presents to the player, and what makes this even more disturbing is how the main objective of escaping the room revolves around the mannequin. This mannequin is supposed to represent Ethan's wife, Mia, who is supposedly dead at this point in time during the events of Village. Having to constantly go back to this doll and separate the limbs for puzzle parts really is psychological pain. And I've also got to note, so far there haven't been any obvious jump scares to the player, rather just this ominous feeling, a feeling not necessarily of fear, but well-crafted tension, as you just get the feeling that something is going to go wrong. I kept thinking that this doll was going to come back to life, but if you have played this section, you know that's not the case. And that again just shows how good of a section this escape room is at throwing the player's expectations off completely. And that is also why the second part of House Benevento is also the scariest part, because I don't think anyone could have predicted what was going to happen next. The house has been building up to something relating to the idea of mannequin or dolls, emphasized by the Mia mannequin itself and the many limbs hanging from the ceiling, and to a lesser extent, old-fashioned objects lying around this area. So instead of instantly rewarding the player's suspicion of what might be next to come, the game throws a curveball to the player and goes back to the central plot of Village. Village's narrative isn't exactly the most intriguing narrative in the game, but it does enough to keep the player invested in its story, which in this case is Ethan trying to to find and save his daughter Rose in the village. Although he did find a part of Rose in the castle, we assume to find the next part in this house until suddenly we hear this. This baby laugh isn't just unsettling because it directly relates to the baby theme in the narrative, it also gets us in a more tenser state of mind, as we've come to believe that there isn't exactly anything living in the house other than us, and the baby directly contradicts this subconscious belief. Then the baby comes into play. You hear the slime and steps as it comes toward you, along with the childish gibberish until you see it. This monstrosity is probably the most disgusting and horrifying being that I've seen in a game, even though it isn't. There are a lot more disturbing looking video game enemies, just look at other Resident Evil games, Silent Hill or Outlast. But why this one stands out is because of how much it built up an image in our mind and shatters it entirely when we see it. Lots of times these disturbing looking enemy types just show up with no prior build up, making you disgusted for a short while but not having any long term effect, as it was just an obstacle that was placed there. Yes, the baby is also an obstacle placed in the game to overcome, but by how the game built up this moment is just nothing short of a masterpiece. And yeah, having it chase you around as you hear it giggle and slowly crawl, and then that final scream as you take the elevator, goosebumps. Terrifying. And after getting back up to the main floor of the house, we have the boss encounter, which is a fairly simple find the doll a few times and you win. I really don't have much else to say because after the incredibly tense moment with the baby, this was a step back down again. I'm not saying it's bad, just that it doesn't reach the same heights. The best thing about this section is that the doll theme foreshadowed from the escape room earlier comes back, making the whole section come full circle. Dolls are also a pretty common fear for us, especially old looking ones that tend to have very realistic features that can set our minds off for a while, thinking they moved or something. But overall, the whole section did great, setting up a thematic theme in the escape room, bringing back a vital plot point in the second part to scare us even more and breaking us psychologically, and tying up the thematic theme in the end. Perfection. House Benavento is still my favorite horror sequence in any game that I've played, and having recently played the new Cyberpunk 2077 expansion that had a really good horror sequence made me think about this one and why it works so well. It does stand out from the rest of the game as being the scary outlier, but it's well deserved because of how it manages to create a very short horror experience that lasts the right amount of time, builds up phenomenally well, and has just the right amount of horror and scares. I think I read somewhere that the best way to describe this is that Resident Evil Village is the least scary Resident Evil game until it decides to become it. And with that, welcome to the end of the video. I hope that you enjoyed the video. If you did, a like, a comment with your own thoughts would mean a lot, and if you did not like the video, a dislike helps a lot too, as it helps me gauge what type of content works or doesn't work. And if you really want to see more from me, a subscribe comes a long way in helping the channel out. With that said, I'm not playing any specific games in particular right now, because next week is gaming season. First we got Sonic Superstars, which I hope Amazon delivers on the right time before we get Super Mario Wonder and Spider-Man 2 on Friday. That's a lot of games to get through, but anyways, that's all for me. Thanks so much for watching again, and have a good rest of your day, night, and week. And with that, Storm out.